We all have different parts of us at war, and that when we move against the parts of ourselves that are feeling or doing the things that we don't like, it actually strengthens them. It causes our suffering to increase.
So tell us that moment when working with your clients. What is that connecting of the dots, the aha moment that really makes recovery that much faster, if you will, and then sobriety that much easier? What is that big realization in your practice?
Yeah, so the big realization for me is the awareness that we all have different parts of us at war, and that when we move against the parts of ourselves that are feeling or doing the things that we don't like, it actually strengthens them. It causes our suffering to increase. And it's actually when we move toward these parts with curiosity and compassion that they're able to transform. And so what I encounter is a lot of people who do tend to be high achieving CEOs, business owners, these types of things, who get into recovery to sobriety by moving against the part of themselves that's acting out in the way that is causing harm. And they get sober, but then continue to either relapse or find themselves feeling very stuck, not in recovery or emotional sobriety. And they say, well, I don't understand. I'm doing all the things. I'm going to the meetings, calling my sponsor. And that is the magic of the intersection of the two models of therapy that I like to use, which is, of course, the CSAT model, but then also the innovative and cutting edge model of therapy called internal family systems, meaning working with the different parts of ourselves that are at war, that are actually creating our symptoms and our suffering.
I cannot wait for this conversation because I think I've heard it from a lot of the CSAT perspective. I've heard of it from a lot of the deceptive sexuality perspective, but it's going to be really interesting from your perspective to integrate these two. Because a lot of the times it's like, yeah, I've heard that before. And then I've heard that before, but it's like, yeah, but have you seen the two together? I really like that. Let's just start with an example of this. So I think one of the biggest issues that my men say over and over again is because, a lot of the men in my group are executives, high achievers, high performers. They've done really well for themselves and they know how to talk. They're charismatic. And so for the most part, a lot of them are in a phenomenal relationship. Usually they're married and they love their wife, and their wife is usually very attractive. I've even heard men say, they'll tell me, I heard a guy say it to me yesterday, Roland, out of all the women that I have acted out with, my wife is the most attractive. I want to hear your diagnosis of that, because I hear it over and over again. What is wrong with me? How can my wife be this amazing person who I love, respect, and who I am incredibly sexually attracted to, yet I still do what I do?
Of course. And of course, sexual addiction and acting out compulsively has nothing to do with the appearance of your available partner. So that makes a ton of sense. But actually, the internal family systems model turns our approach to healing from addiction completely upside down. It is the reverse of what we typically do. And because I am part of the teaching faculty for the CSAT approach, but I'm also a clinical supervisor and consultant for the IFS model, I like to interweave these two because they really are magical in not only depathologizing these struggles where we ask ourselves, what is wrong with me? Why am I doing things that I don't want to do? They help us make sense of that. And they also help it to transform much more successfully. So in a nutshell, it might be helpful if I give a really brief overview of the IFS model. When many people hear internal family systems, they think external family, mom, dad, brother, sister. And that's not actually what we're talking about. The internal system is actually the awareness that all of us have many different parts and our parts are at war. So it's very common, and we sort of get this intuitively. One part of me wants to eat all the Oreos and another part of me wants to go to the gym and eat kale. And those two parts of me don't get along very well. They have different objectives, different goals. I
think the most pronounced is, the part of you that in college was having as many of these sexual experiences as possible. And then the other part of you who wants to be this loyal, monogamous, trustworthy confidant, this powerful, stable member of your family. These two have a hard time existing.
Exactly. And of course, this magnifies as our struggles become more significant. So it may start out with a silly example of eating Oreos or going to the gym, and then it becomes a lot more serious when the struggles that we're dealing with escalate. And so I'm really familiar with high achievers. My career before I was a therapist was working on Capitol Hill with senators, congressmen, and the White House. And so I am very familiar with sort of the milieu of those who run in powerful circles and hold a great deal of influence. And what I know to be true, and why it is the case that so many of us who are successful, driven, oriented toward achievement, power, influence, who are charismatic, also have these hidden struggles with various types of addiction, is because those two things are parallel processes. And so, in a nutshell, what happens and what we need to know about ourselves is that who we are at our core is what IFS refers to as the self. It's this always undamaged, loving, kind, connected, courageous, wise, healing energy inside of us. Different traditions refer to it differently. Spiritual traditions call it the image of God, or Buddha nature, or Atman. But whatever you call it, IFS refers to it as the authentic self. It's always there inside of each of us at all times, but it gets obscured, kind of like the clouds covering the sun, when our burdened parts take us over and do the things that they do. And what we know in addition to this self is that when we experience negative events in our lives, our parts become burdened. They become covered over. So if you think about my fist as a part of me, you can envision that it becomes covered over with a burden. We call it a burden in IFS. In clinical language, we call it trauma. And it obscures the positive nature of that part of me. And so a playful part, for example, a part of me that's designed to be playful may get shamed, yelled at, or abused if I'm playful and make a mess when I'm a child. And now instead of being playful, that part only feels shame. It only feels the burden of this. And so these negative life experiences, whether they are capital T traumas or lowercase t traumas, happen to all of us in our life. And these vulnerable parts of us become burdened. And when they get triggered, when they cover over the sun, so to speak, and we are flooded with the vulnerable feelings like shame, worthlessness, powerlessness, brokenness, which is, of course, the triggers for addiction, two other types of parts of us try to protect us from that. And this is where the high achieving addiction polarity comes into play. The first type of part IFS refers to as a manager, and it's proactive. So these parts of us look really shiny and try to manage our lives in such a way that we will be well received in the world. So we will be successful, we will achieve, people will like us. And they work very hard to prevent the pain of those exiled, those vulnerable parts of us from getting triggered. But because they are trying to do a job that's bigger than they can handle, they eventually will fail. So the overworking, the people pleasing, the making money, eventually it's not enough to appease the tenderness of these vulnerable parts. And the shame or the worthlessness, the powerlessness will get triggered. And when that happens, and here's the key point, what IFS refers to as firefighter parts, the reactive protectors, come in to put out the fire of the pain of that vulnerability. And the firefighters are all the parts that wind up in my office. So those are all the parts of us that are engaged in addiction, in self-harm, suicidality, cutting, you name it, dissociation. And these two protective systems that are both trying to protect our vulnerability in opposite ways are equally powered. because they have to be, because they are parallel processes. And so what that means is the more successful we are, if that's driven from a burdened part rather than from who we truly are, the more powerful our reactive protectors are going to be. And this is why we see all kinds of people in leadership continually, quote, fall. They're stealing money, they're having an affair with their secretary, they're sexually addicted, they're doing drugs. And this is a regular occurrence, whether it's a religious leader or a business leader or a political leader. This is routine. And most of the time we shake our heads and say, I just can't believe it. He seems like such a great guy. His family's so perfect. I'm using gender typical pronouns for your audience. This can be equally applied to women. And how could he be doing this thing in secret? And the answer is because the parts of him that are engaged in those behaviors, the overworking and the overachieving, are not who he truly is. And they're polarized with the parts that are trying to soothe the pain by acting out, by stealing the money, by drinking, whatever it might be. And what we typically do in addiction recovery is we target the one part that is acting out in whatever the way, so sexually in this case, and we try to kick it out. We try to lock it in the basement. We try to say, this is bad, you are bad, and you need to leave. Now, there's a problem with this, and anyone who's gotten sober and not in recovery and stuck knows what the problem is. Number one, you can't kick any parts of yourself out of your system. It's not possible. Number two, you don't want to, because if we kick the part of ourselves that is engaged in the acting out behavior out of the system, we lose its natural positive quality. And the natural positive quality that's underneath the sexual addiction, almost every single time when we do that trauma healing work, the unburdening work, this is the part that is sexually connected, emotionally connected, spiritually connected to the partner. So if we were to try to kick the sexual addiction out of the system, we're going to lose the ability to connect intimately with the partner. And people run into that all the time when they're trying to sexually reintegrate after disclosure. And they're like, I don't get it. My spouse is gorgeous, is amazing. And this is not working well. And the reason why is if our approach to sobriety and recovery is to move against the part of ourselves that's acting out, and that's all we do, it will fail, because the pain that part is attempting to address is still unaddressed. And so either that part will come back out of the basement and take over, which is chronic relapse, or other firefighters will have to jump in. And that's why when you walk into a 12-step meeting, you usually have to walk through a cloud of smoke, stand in line at a long line to get coffee and caffeine, and go sit down next to your buddies who've all gained 30 pounds in recovery. It's because you might be sober from the acting out. So the smoking, the caffeine, the overworking, and the eating are going to have to ramp up if we haven't addressed what's happening with the exiles. And so IFS gives us a completely opposite way of approaching the healing process that I find to be much more compassionate and much more effective in the long run, because it doesn't encourage us to move against those parts. It actually encourages us to move toward them, be curious about how they're trying to help us in unhelpful ways, and invite them onto the treatment team so that we can do the deeper healing work. And it's a game changer.
You said, oh my gosh, you articulated something so nicely there. And I think this is, Carnes refers to this in like the recovery zone books as the grief phase, but essentially it's really easy, and you'll hear this in the CSAT world a lot. It's really easy for men to get sober, those first 8 months, and not always the case. There are people who have become fairly, but I would say a lot of my clients, because of their their positions with their career. The addiction hasn't gotten to this point where they're watching pornography for, 5-6 hours a day. It's the addiction for them a lot of time. And so they'll come in they'll have this like relatively easy, if you can say it, a sobriety period for the first 6 to 8 months. Or let's say sobriety is easy. Let's say they're one of the lucky ones, and sobriety is really easy for them for let's say a year, maybe even a year or two. You articulate something so well. If it's easy for us in the heat of the moment when we have violated the love of our life and we have these beautiful kids, and it's just so ugly what we did. It's easy to the point, like you said, grab that whole person, including the one underneath every of it, and throw them in a place and just say, you know what, I'm going to be someone else who has no problems. I'm going to go to 3 12-step meetings a week. I'm going to go to weekly therapy. I'm going to go to this intensive, this treatment center. But I think you articulated something really, really well, because as you've seen, relapse in this particular addiction is, it's a real thing. You go to the 12-step meetings. A lot of long-term sobriety in those rooms is quite low. And I think you articulated something so nicely, especially for high achievers. There's a lot of us that we love, and we love to express. We love to play a big game. And I think you articulated something so well. It's easy to do that for a year, but I think there's part of you that after a year is like, I'm tired of being suppressed. I'm tired of being locked away. And, then there's this kind of returning of, well, what about me? What about my attention? What about my needs? And to your point, that's because you can't lock up the self with all of this stuff on top of him and run from it. There will be a desire for that to come back. And if there are still things, in the case of this, if there are still rags of trauma over him, he will come back, and those will be on top. You will be happy to have yourself come back because it does feel good. But then you also have all of these adaptations on top. But you articulated it really, really well. And I do think that is the challenge. Is it's easy to become someone entirely different to try to save your marriage. But how sustainable is that, especially as a high achiever? High achievers, the one things that I've noticed about them, there's a lot about themselves that they like. There's a lot of things they really love about themselves. And so I don't know how sustainable it is to trash all of it without wanting some of it back. And then, how safe is it when you return? A lot of people, they haven't done the work. Their recovery, when they tell me what they did, they're like, oh, I did this, and this, and I haven't acted out. And I'm just like, oh boy, I'm very concerned about the longevity of this. But did that speak to that before we go on? Is that, I like the way that you said that, because it is at a certain point, they feel soulless, if you will. And it's like, well, I don't feel like me again. So I want to come back to being me. And then, what's that mean from a longevity standpoint?
Yeah, well, it's actually just slightly different. So how IFS approaches this is different, because many of those sort of managerial approaches to sobriety, for example, involve really kind of giving steroids to the proactive team. So this side that's trying to manage our lives, that would be the inner critic, the part that wants to get sober, the part that wants to be a good husband, father, leader, etc. And if our approach to healing is just to try to increase this side, because these two sides are polarized, what we're actually doing is strengthening the side that's acting out. And this is how most addiction recovery proceeds. Don't you see the damage that's happening to your relationship? What's the matter with you? You're an addict. You need to lock this in the basement. That's coming from a manager, not our core authentic self. So we cannot lock the authentic self in the basement, but we can try from our managers to lock these reactive parts in the basement, and it will not work. That's why I believe our relapse rates and our hopelessness is so high, because if that's what we're trying to do, we're actually strengthening the parts that are acting out. They may go on lockdown for a while, and then they come back with a vengeance. IFS suggests that what we want to do is to actually approach recovery and sobriety from our authentic self, from who we truly are. And that accomplishes two things. First of all, we are not aligning with one side over another in this inner battle. Now, I want to be clear that what IFS is not saying is that the behavior of any of these parts is good or okay. It's not. IFS is saying that the most successful way to transform that behavior is to engage with it from our authentic self in a curious and compassionate way, get to know this part of me and how it's trying to help in unhelpful ways. But additionally, then getting permission from these polarized parts of ourselves that are in these protective roles to go to the vulnerable ones, the ones that get triggered and cause the relapse, cause the acting out, and do that deeper trauma healing work. Because if we don't heal the deeper trauma, the parts who are stuck in these roles really cannot transform long term. They can't, because there's unaddressed pain there. And this is really pivotal, because talk therapy is not trauma healing. So talking about it and understanding, like, oh, I understand why I act out. I understand my history. I've talked about my trauma. That all is going to the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that's most recently evolved that handles executive functioning and decision making and that type of thing. That is not where trauma lives. Trauma lives in the limbic part of the brain, and addiction is a symptom of trauma. And so if we do not speak to the limbic part of the brain and heal the trauma, no amount of prefrontal cortex is going to override that. And every one of us walking the face of the earth knows that, because that's why we do things that we don't want to do. That's why I eat Oreos instead of eating kale, is because when we are triggered and our vulnerable parts have taken us over, we are no longer, the prefrontal cortex is no longer online. The limbic survival part of the brain is what is in operation. And so talking about it, filling out thought charts, doing all of this stuff is good. It is necessary and not sufficient. So EMDR, IFS, SE, some type of trauma healing work is required. We have to heal these deeper vulnerabilities that have usually occurred in our early life attachment experiences that have created these felt senses of who I am is bad. If you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. I'm all alone. There's no one here to help me. It's all up to me. Those types of core beliefs of addiction are what has kicked off the addictive processes, as well as the over-functioning processes. When we can heal that, here's the game changer. Both sides of this polarization can heal. So not only the acting out, but also the compulsive overworking, the people pleasing, the focusing on external appearances, whatever it might be, which, interestingly, take us out of our ability to connect intimately with our beloved and our children, every bit as much as the acting out.
And and just for everyone listening too, because I know I know a lot of the men in our group, the trauma word's tough because they didn't have perfect I wouldn't say that. I would say 50% of them did at some point in time. They regret saying it now, but they did went on the record at one point in time saying, I did have a perfect childhood. I was supported, I was loved, I was signed up for everything to sign up. I had private coaches for every sport. If there was anything that I wanted there, within reason, my parents would try to do whatever that was. And I think it's important for everybody listening, especially because my primary audience is high achievers, executives. A lot of these people did come from families where maybe your father or mother were in these same positions. And just so everyone understands, when we say the word trauma, we're not always referring to, everyone's like, oh, well, there's no point for me to do any of those things because I have nothing living in this back part of my brain. I think high achievers need to understand, trauma is as it's really defined, it's anything really that's harming the ability to be authentic, really. And the biggest thing that we see in our group is the pressure to be a particular thing and to believe something. So basically, this little perfect person who had a purpose of their own. That was supposed to, let's say, go over in this direction. They had wonderful parents who said, yes, you are going to be so happy. I can't wait for you to become this. This is going to be so wonderful for you. Look how much money you're going to make. Look at the woman you're going to be with. Look at your religious faith and what it's going to turn into. I can't wait for you to go over here. Yet here was a beautiful soul who was actually designed to go over here. And just so everyone understands, that is trauma. That was my trauma. My parents were, they did the best they could, but they never took an interest in what I felt, what I wanted to become. It was from before my earliest memory. Oh, I can't wait for you to become this. We're going to love you so much, and you're going to be so happy, and you're going to be so successful. And here I am as a 3-year-old saying, okay, yes, mom and dad, tell me more about what I need to do. Can you put this back into your model now? Because I think those initial traumas, a lot of people see that and hear that word and they think, oh, no one touched me. No one said anything. But again, those initial ones can be, oh, I can't wait for you to go to Harvard. I mean, that can be a trauma. Can you speak to that in your framework?
I absolutely can, because I went to Harvard and I carry that trauma. So if I may, let me use my own life for an example. And anyone who is struggling with addiction and doesn't know about trauma needs to know about trauma, because trauma exists for all of us. We are all trauma survivors. And exactly as you said, Roland, trauma, we sometimes have ways of differentiating. The sort of obvious traumas that most everyone would readily identify. Someone is beating me. Someone has sexually abused me. Someone is screaming things at me. You're such a loser. What's the matter with you? I can't believe you're not as good as your brother. Sexual, physical, verbal abuse. Most people can identify that. But there's stealth trauma, which is the type of trauma that I experienced, and probably many people who are in your community experienced. And that is, well, let me pause for a moment and say that even people who experience these overt traumas, or sometimes are called capital T traumas, they were sexually abused, they were beaten. Denial is one of the only ways that we can survive those types of traumas as a child, because most children don't have the resources to leave that environment. And so a part of us develops that learns how to not know and not see and not feel what is actually happening, because it's literally the only way we can survive. Dissociation works in much the same way. When we don't have the power to get out, a part of us will learn how to take us over and get us out, even if our body can't leave.
Yeah, I will. Fine. I will go to Harvard. Just so everyone understands, like that, it can be a small little sellout of self. It's just easier. Okay, fine. I'm going to do, because for me, it was just I grew up in a LDS household, and it was just easier for me to, just, going against it was really, really difficult as a young child. And so it was just easier to just go with it from that day forward.
Well, actually, in this case, I'm referring more to the denial of, yes, I had a wonderful family. Well, yeah, my dad would beat me with the belt, but that he was just spanking me. He was just disciplining me in love. Sure. The narrative that I had a perfect childhood is a hallmark of trauma.
Sure.
So it's very common for many of us to come into the healing journey and say, I don't know what you're talking about. I had a perfect childhood. And we want to get curious about that, because no one had a perfect childhood. And it's not about pointing fingers and blame. Most of us have parents or adoptive parents or whatever it might be, who were doing the best they could. And trauma is real. So that's the capital T, the more overt traumas: sexual, physical, verbal abuse, as well as attachment rupture, abandonment. So if your parents were divorced, if dad or mom was at the office or working at church all day long and was not available for you, that kind of abandonment trauma, or was traveling 5 days a week, every single week, and so you only was only physically present 2 days. That's abandonment trauma. And also neglect would fit in there. And those are overt
Mhm.
traumas. Covert trauma is much more stealth. It's much harder to identify. And I'll give you an example. So I grew up in a very loving family, mom and dad still married, um, and genuinely desired for me to have and
Mhm.
do all the things that they could possibly
Mhm.
provide. We were very lower middle class. Dad was in the army, mom was a school teacher, but they scrimped and saved to send me to private school.
Mhm.
And all the things, and no one was beating me. And I was told that I was loved. My needs were provided for, medical care, food, etc. I was told that I was going to do great things. So this is wonderful, right? Sounds great. Sounds ideal. And it was in many ways. And because of my dad's military service, he was in Vietnam when I was born, so there was no father present when I was born to attach to. And then every year or two, my entire life growing up, we moved. That was no one's fault. That's what you do in the military. But that was a trauma for me because I never had a home. And I was always the
Mhm.
kid that didn't fit in, that was new, that was on the outside of the pack looking in. And
Mhm.
if you understand Peter Levine and somatic experiencing, it's hardwired into our DNA, our limbic system, that being on the outside of the pack, being the kid that's not a part of the group, is actually a life or death threat in our neurologic system, because the animal in the wild that will die is the one that's on the outside of the pack. That's
Mhm.
the one that the lion will take down and kill. So our neurologic system is hardwired for inclusion. And I had every single year or two of my life this repetitive message of I don't belong, I don't fit
Mhm.
in, and I don't have a home, and I don't have any lifelong friendships. That was a major trauma in my life. I was a therapist
Mhm.
in my 40s before I recognized that as a trauma.
Yeah.
In addition, I went to Punahou in Hawaii for high school. Sounds great, right? Here are the people that were also went to Punahou: Barack Obama,
Mhm.
Carrie Ann Inaba, who's on Dancing with the Stars, Albert Chang, who's the COO, I believe, of Amazon Studios, Steve Case, who founded AOL, and me. And I was in a very perfectionist environment where everyone was flourishing. And I was awkward and had buck teeth and, headgear, and I couldn't quite keep my head above water academically. And I have lots of trauma around not good
Mhm.
enough, stupid, ugly, that kind of trauma. Nobody was beating me with a belt. That is very real trauma that drove a lot of high performing
Mhm.
behavior on my part. So I wound up going to Harvard and I got my first master's degree from Harvard. Well, that was the first.
Mhm.
So these overperforming parts worked very hard to try to soothe the pain of that. I run my own company, multiple companies, and have a successful international speaking business and consulting, and I teach and I write best-selling books. These parts are working very hard, not because anybody ever beat me, but because I have these
Mhm.
young, vulnerable parts of me that feel I'm on the outside of the
Mhm.
pack and I'm not good enough. And so we need to have a very clear radar for the covert traumas, because for many of us who are high achieving, those covert traumas are driving the high
Mhm.
achieving behavior, and they're actually continuing to harm us because we're exhausted, we're isolated, we feel like we can't let people see who we really
Mhm.
are, we can't share our vulnerability. And when that vulnerability gets triggered, that's when the reactive
Yes.
ones, the
Oh my
soothing,
gosh. Yes, you
self-soothing
said it
ones
so
fall
well. Oh
in.
my gosh, you said
Yeah.
it so well, because I think a lot of the times it does not look like trauma. I think you articulated it
Mhm.
perfectly.
Yeah.
It's because if you look at the story, it's like, look at all of these things that I did. How could this be traumatic? And I think you articulated it really, really well,
Yeah.
because and the beauty of because I was blessed in the early stages of my addiction to have a internal family systems therapist, and we did all these really neat exercises that allowed us to see me as this. You know what exercises I'm talking about? Probably. I saw myself as this bunch of selves, essentially. But I think you articulate so nicely, and I think everyone listening can understand that, you have this huge thing that was built over here and it looks great, but in the end, it really exists because, at least in my case, there was a thing equally as large, if not larger down here. And I needed this one to make sure that this one didn't get no one could see it. And that even if they did see it, it was like, oh yeah, sure, it's over there, but look at this. Right. So it was like, okay, I hope they never see it. But if they ever did, I would throw the resume in their face. But I think the point that I would like to, and I'd love for you to speak on this, because I'm going to speak from my standpoint. I'd love for you to put it in your model. I think the problem for me with that, because here's the truth. That whole thing works in this world quite nicely. One, depends on what your definition of working, but it works quite nicely. It looks like it does, at least. My perspective of somebody who did that, and now knowing what I know through recovery, because recovery is just such a blessing. I know your wives won't feel that way, but it is such a blessing. For them, it's like, I don't know if they ever want it to be called that, because it's the worst thing that ever happened to them. But nonetheless, the marriages that survive, the reason that they thrive is because it was a blessing, because they fell in love with 4% of you and now they get 100% of you. And so they're, it's this magnificent thing that happens. But, for me, it's really unhuman to do what I just talked about. I think that's why it always collapses on people, because in theory it works, because if they ever find out about this thing, you just say, well, look at this. And then you are, you always have this resume to back up why this whole piece of you is irrelevant. But it's I think, and to me, the reason I believe, at least, that it always collapses is it's just unhuman. There's no part of being alive in any book I've ever read that says that is what you need to do and that's sustainable, because it's just, there's a lot of flaws and a lot of lying that has to happen, because I think, to your point, and that's why I loved this approach when my early recovery was start seeing it's not a perfect, this cancels out that. It actually doesn't. There's a lot of stuff that this does that I actually have to create another thing to cancel out that. Yeah. And then this one, I have to create another and another. And then this one has side effects. And then this one has side effects. And they all start having these side effects. And next thing you know, I'm scrambling trying to cure the side effects of each treatment to this thing that I thought I had perfectly. I'd love for you to put it into your model, because I think as time goes on, that's why I think they always get, this always blows up in their face at some point in time. I was blessed that it blew up early, because I think it was a bit easier for me to manage, because the acting out behaviors were shorter than some. But I mean, I've been to intensives where, these guys, their numbers are in the 500s, the thousands. And that's, that just makes it, it's a bit of a barrier when you have to disclose 35 years and 1,000 acts of acting out. But put that into your model. This, I don't know what you would want to call it. I'd be interested to hear your definition of it.
Yeah, I think you make a beautiful point, Roland. And what I would say is it's very human to have these parts that become burden. That's actually a natural state. And if you want to think, so C. Sykes is an IFS trainer who does brilliant work with addiction. In fact, she participated in my most recent book, Altogether Us, and wrote this beautiful chapter on using IFS in healing addiction. But she conceptualizes our inner being on a triangle. And so you can think about who you truly are is that core authentic self is in the center of the triangle. The vulnerable parts of us that get burdened with these painful life experiences that we try to exile are kind of at the bottom of the triangle. If you think about it, it's an inverted triangle. And we call them in IFS exiles, because everything in us tries to exile them and get rid of them, because they're carrying all the painful emotions and beliefs, shame, powerlessness, brokenness. If you really knew me, you wouldn't love me. The proactive managers are over here on this corner of the triangle, and the reactive firefighters are on this corner. So you have this kind of very simple way of conceptualizing what happens inside of us when we experience and become burdened with these painful life experiences. So a key piece of the IFS paradigm is that we want to approach all these parts of ourselves and our healing, our sobriety, and our recovery from this authentic self, because that's who you truly are. That's who I truly am. That's who everyone listening truly is. You are not an addict. Who you are is this loving, wise, kind, courageous, authentic self. A part of you has gotten stuck in an unhelpful role, acting out sexually, drinking, whatever it is, overachieving because of the pain of the exiles. But that's not who you are. Who you are is this authentic self inside of you. And furthermore, all these parts of us are actually good. They've just gotten stuck in these unhelpful roles. And what we know, this is a couple of key pieces here. Don't miss this. The power of the managers and the firefighters, the strength of these two has got to equal the pain of the exiles.
Mm-hmm.
If the exiles are not in a lot of pain, we don't need very big managers or firefighters. When the exiles are in a tremendous amount of pain, we're going to be the CE freaking O, and we are going to be acting out with thousands of people. Why? Because those two opposite parts of us, they're trying to help us with our pain in opposite ways, are trying to cover over an extraordinary amount of trauma or pain that our exiles are carrying. So that's a really important thing to know, which is why people who are high achieving, Olympic athletes, CEOs, etc., many times have extreme pain in their exiles, have lots of trauma that needs to be healed because it's driving that hyper over functioning. And the acting out behavior is also going to be extremely strong. So that's really important to know, is when we see tons of acting out, tons of overachieving, it's often letting us know that the exiles, the trauma is intense. And oh gosh, there was one other thing you just said that I wanted to speak to. What was it?
Well, the sentence stands out, and I don't like this sentence because but this is a phrase that a lot of people have heard, the loudest man in the room is the weakest man in the room. And I don't like the term weak because, again, I think that's an inaccurate label for the things that individual is dealing with. But I still resonate with that because in my recovery, I did. I bought a $210,000 car. There were things that I did to make sure that when I showed up, it was like, I want to make it very, very clear that I am better than all of you. I mean, that was the energy. Now, did I ever logically know that was what I was doing? No, and I would have never admitted that. And if you would have confronted me back then, I would say, "Oh no, I just like that car," and "Oh no, I just love Ted Baker and the designer." I would have come up with some excuse. But the truth is, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I made the money I made early on because I knew the fastest way to separate myself from every other 29-year-old was to have millions and millions of dollars, because that was what 29-year-olds didn't have. And so it was, a lot of high achievers, that's the thing, is they're not stupid. The recipe is, that's why they accomplish so much, is how do I shut everyone up? Men, women, old people, young people. And that's why they go do the things that they do, because it's like, hey, what would, okay, sure, this would be fine, but that would only impress my peers. What could I do that would shut everyone up? And I think that is the hallmark of a really high achiever is, and I still to this day, even through recovery, find myself attracted to things that would silence the masses, because it's like, oh, wow, well, if I accomplish that, then everyone, I mean, it just shows you how deep these little, because I would, it's funny, it would be it would be called a little T trauma. If you look at what it did to my life, I almost kind of don't like to call it a little T trauma, because it's like, if this poor little Roland was convinced that if he did nothing, that he would be inadequate the way he is, and that he would be unseen, unnoticed, he would live a meaningless life. That sounds like I don't know, one could call that a little T trauma. To me, I think about my daughter. She just turned 5 on Tuesday. I think about her, and I just pray she doesn't feel the way I felt when I was 4, because The amount of suffering that went on for years and years and years. And here's the worst part about this. And this is the last thing I'd love you to speak to, because I think you personally, if you're open to it, can speak to this.
Yeah.
I think the scariest part for high achievers, and scary, I think, is the accurate word. You start to catch on to your own bullshit, but you can't complain or ask for help, because from a capitalist standpoint, your life is awesome. You have things currently that most people will never have, and you're on a trajectory to have more than the people who have more have. And so every time you like feel a little safe, like, oh my gosh, can I tell people that I'm actually way more miserable than I ever was ever before? It's really scary, because everyone's telling you your life is perfect, and it's almost like you were already struggling because that's why you were so successful. And then you get this layer on top of, well, everything's perfect. And so it's like, oh, well, I guess I should just shut up and not complain. I'd love you to take us home on that one, because I think that is, I think a lot of people in this particular addiction, especially as high achievers, are suffering in silence, because it's like, well, I guess nothing's wrong with me.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think this is really a beautiful point that you make. And I agree with you on the capital T, lowercase t, which is why I always put it in kind of air quotes. I like overt trauma and covert trauma more, but overt and covert traumas can have exactly the same impact on our souls.
I would say for a high achiever, though, telling them to be someone they're not, in my opinion, there's nothing more traumatic to someone who's born to be expressive and create change, to say, that's cute, go do this. Right. I think that's a very traumatic. So I just wanted to highlight that, because I think it depends on the person how traumatic that particular thing is. Right.
Yeah. And I think for anyone to hear that who you are is not enough is a massive trauma.
Yes.
Yeah. No matter how you heard it. If someone was saying, I love you and you need to get straight A's, and if you get an A-, it's not enough, or I love you and you can't do anything wrong because it's going to make dad look bad and the pastorate, and you're going to humiliate God because you're the pastor's kid. That's a capital T trauma in my book. I think it's all massive. But I think you make a really important point here, Roland, and that's exactly where we started. So it comes full circle. And that is, if the way that we approach recovery is just by empowering the managers, we're making the problem worse. If it's just earn money, look good, drive the fancy car, and just keep the plastic fantastic going, we're actually making the problem worse. And both sides of this polarization, here's an important thing to know about these protector parts: the overworking, achieving, shiny ones, and the ones that are doing all the things that we don't want to talk about. This is true of both of them. They're both trying to help us with our pain. And both of them work in the short run, and they're both making it worse in the long run. Universally true. So the achieve, make money, have the perfect life, shiny. Yeah, that feels better in the short run. And in the long run, you wind up being Tom Brady, who just won the umpteenth Super Bowl, formerly married to the supermodel, saying, and I quote, "Is this all there is?"
Yes, correct.
That's where that gets you. And it's hopeless. It's every bit as hopeless as the guy in the gutter on the street. And the firefighters, these reactive protectors who are shooting up, drinking, hooking up with X, Y, and Z, thousands of people, looking at all the porn, thinking about suicide. Those parts are also trying to help us with our pain. If I take that drink, if I look at that sexual image, if I hook up with that person, well, then just for a moment, I will feel soothed. I'll have some self-soothing. I'll feel touched. A lot of people struggling with sexual addiction have touch deprivation, have never had intimate, safe, nurturing touch. The suicidal parts, a lot of people say, well, how is that trying to help me? Well, a suicidal part is an escalated firefighter that says, this pain is so great and everything that you're doing is not working. I know how to fix the pain. I don't want to do this, but I can turn the lights out and that will take care of the pain. So even suicidal and homicidal parts of us have a positive intention. What they're doing is bad, no question. But it always makes it worse in the long run, because after you sober up the next morning, or after you've acted out with the prostitute or your 1000th affair partner, the next morning or the week later, when you kind of wake up and realize, what no, I'm threatening everything. Why am I doing this? It always makes our suffering worse. And the reason is because these parts of us don't have the power to heal our trauma. Self has the power. And when we approach healing from a self-led place, all these parts can unleash their burdens and can be restored to their fundamentally positive nature. And what that is going to mean is that not only will the acting out parts transform, and the acting out will stop once we do the trauma healing work, but so will the overachieving and the fixation on making all the money and the looking perfect, because both of those are keeping us away from our authentic experience. And there will be a settling. And so the unanticipated long-term grief work of true recovery can be that my old community no longer fits me, because I'm not focused on all the shiny and how much money I have and how impressive my resume is. I actually am just me. I'm here. I'm hardworking. I want to do well, but it's not all about that, because that focus will kick off this polarization again. And that is not a healed place. So we cannot come at recovery from just more shiny.
You said it really nicely. I always tell the men in my group will ask me that. And it's almost like a fear, like, Roland, I don't want to give up a lot of this. Like, I want to make an impact, and these are the people I want to impact. Here's how I say it. And this is a lot of because of the therapists who use this internal family systems with me. I say, you know what? Here's the difference. I said, you'll acknowledge that is happening, and you won't participate. So you'll be in it, you'll be at the gala, and you might have bought the table because there are people at the table who would be beneficial for the impact that you're trying to create. And you know, it's all bullshit, right? It's like, I also know this isn't making me a better person or a worse person. I am always the same. So is everyone in this room. And the game is set up in this way, and I will create a bigger impact if I play the game without losing myself in the game. It's how I always articulate it. It's like there's a way to do both without harming yourself and your loved ones. I got to ask, as we're wrapping up, where are you licensed, and how can, if someone was loving this and wanted to do some of this work, how do they find you? How do they interact with you? What do you have to offer folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am in Atlanta, but I'm not seeing individual clients really much anymore at all. Most of what I do is training other therapists and teaching and speaking. And so if you'd like me to come into your organization and teach about IFS, I'm glad to do that. People can check out my website, which is movetoward.com. My name will also get you there, but most people can't spell it, JennaRiemersma.com. And you're welcome to check out my books if you're interested in this model. My first book is Altogether You. My second book is Altogether Us. So you don't have to think hard on the titles. And I also have lots of free content, guided meditations, online courses for people, both on my website as well as on the free Insight Timer meditation app. So I've got
that's exciting. I love that. I'll look at that. I'm a frequent user. So
beautiful.
Awesome. I love the approach to this, especially for the high achiever. You do not want to leave stones unturned, especially for us, because those stones might seem small. They ain't for a lot of high achievers. They're quite big, and it could be the secret. But thank you so much. I hope that we do this again.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me, Roland.